Hi, my name is Levi Lyle. I live in Keota, Iowa. I grew up on a farm here and farm about 250 acres. I started getting into organic farming about 10 years ago when I moved back to the farm. I was interested in no-till organic farming, and my wife and I both grew up on family farms in this area. So when we moved back, I started experimenting with those processes, and that led me to transitioning a small part of the operation to organic. I got involved in roller crimping and growing cover crops, and so that has just progressively led to more and more organic and no-till experiences on the farm.
A little bit about your role as an organic inspector.
When I first started organic inspecting, part of what led me there was I had transitioned to organic, and having inspectors come out to the farm each year to visit and do the site audit, I thought was interesting. They would go over my records and do a mass balance of all my inputs, and I would get to asking them questions about what they were doing, where they were from. Sometimes they weren't from Iowa, they were from Missouri or Minnesota or Wisconsin, and it was a different person each year often, and so I got to meet these people, and through meeting multiple inspectors, I got to asking questions, and I kind of formed a picture of what it would be like to have a career in organic inspecting. I went to a training, and that then allowed me to go and do inspections for crops. My first certification ground was just 1 acre of aronia berries,
Okay.
and I wanted to do organic row crop farming. My father was quick to remind me that when I was in junior high school, I wasn't that good with the row cultivator. I was always plowing out corn, and these were the days before Roundup had been invented. So there was a lot of row cultivation back when I was 13 and 14 years old. So to kind of bring my dad around, I sought to learn as much as I could in a short period of time, and that was one of the benefits of becoming an organic inspector, was that the steep learning curve allowed me to be on a lot of farms in a short period of time and learn a lot about organic farming. And so that was kind of a bonus benefit to being an inspector. That has been my experience.
Okay, so what kind of background did you need before you could get into your career as being an organic inspector?
Growing up with an agriculture background was definitely helpful. I felt a lot more comfortable going onto a farm where they were growing corn or soybeans. But it's not essential at all, and many of the inspectors that I know or have come to this farm weren't familiar with the crops that I was growing.
Okay.
Many of the farms I went on were vegetable farms. They were growing green beans or cabbage or carrots, and so in that aspect I was out of my element. So
Yep.
I think an inspector is going to have kind of their bread and butter that they can relate to, but the comfort with everything that you're going to come in contact with is, it's like it takes a lot of years of experience before that happens. So I think an inspector just needs to understand that's a process, and not to feel intimidated if you don't know, like how many, you plant 32,000 seeds of corn in an acre, but if you didn't grow up on a farm, that may not be just like at the tip of your tongue. And farmers understand that,
Right.
and they're there to kind of teach you too. I mean, that the part of that process is they're explaining that, and that works well.
Yeah, for sure. So it takes all types, is what you're trying to say here,
Yeah.
Levi. All right, so then aside from your background, what kind of training did you have to go through in order to become an organic inspector?
The training was with IOIA, and it was located in Des Moines, which is about 2 hours from where I live. It was interesting because they have these trainings throughout the United States during the year, and there were people that came from all over, even Puerto Rico and Hawaii. There were Amish farmers from Pennsylvania at the training. So it was a really diverse group of people that I met, and the collaboration between the people in the class was very strong. So at the end of the training, I had these relationships that I was able to maintain and talk to people around the country while I was an inspector and ask them questions. It was a 4.5-day training, so that was a lot of time to spend with this small group of 20 or 25 people, and that's why we formed close relationships. And it was really an excellent training. I was able to learn a lot in a short period of time.
So then diving a little bit more into the inspections themselves, what does a standard process look like for certifying crops, animals, or processing facilities?
Well, I will speak mostly to crops because
Okay.
I was an inspector of crops, and then to go and inspect processing or animal farms or facilities
Yep.
would require an additional level of certification.
Okay.
So for certifying crops, I would get the organic systems plan from the certifier. And so this is a document that the producer had filled out and explained the nature of their operation and the details on that organic systems plan. So then when it gets forwarded to me by the organic certifier, I would review it prior to showing up at the farm to visit the farmer. Then during the inspection, we would go over that document, and then there are certain things that weren't included, such as the seed tags that they would have used for the crops they planted. Also affidavits such as the manure that they had put on. They would have that on file with a signature from whoever's farm that manure came from, saying that no additives were used in that manure, things like that. So we would go over the supporting documents that they had, and then that was usually 2 to even 8 hours if you get into a farm that has a lot of diversity and complexity to it. So after I would leave my appointment, then I would go home and have paperwork I would need to do to pull together that additional information that I had learned, as well as the summary of what I had confirmed from the organic systems plan, and then I would turn in that documentation to the organic certifier. That was my process.
Okay.
I've had inspectors come here that walk in the door with a laptop under one arm and a printer under the other, and they set up, and when they leave here, I kind of get the sense that they're almost done.
Completely done.
And it doesn't really take longer. It's just that while we're covering those things, they're doing their work.
Okay.
And then my nature is to inquire what's going on, as
Yep.
I have said, and so I asked, like, why all this now? And
Mm-hmm.
these inspectors tend to have their process down so efficiently because they do sometimes more than 100 inspections in a year, sometimes 150 inspections in a year, and it is their career.
Okay.
And when I was doing inspections, it was more of a supplemental income
Yep.
situation, and but that's just the difference in the people that are doing it for their own goals, and it's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of that paperwork, what is needed in terms of the paperwork, documentation, and field operations that the operator will have to show to the inspector during the inspection?
Much of that is in the initial application.
Okay.
Usually that's in the early spring when the application is due to be submitted to the certifier. Then there are supplemental materials such as, and the list is long, I'll name a few because I'm a row crop farming, a manure affidavit. If I
Okay.
were to get manure put on my fields here from another farm, then that farm where I'm getting manure from would have to sign the affidavit. I don't need to send that in with my application. I just need to keep it on file for when my inspector asks about it.
Okay.
Also, seed tags from
Yep.
any inputs, any at all. So whether it's fertilizers that I'm putting on that are organic approved or a seed that's organic, there are certain situations where an input may not be organic certified, such as if seed is not available in the organic crop, then non-GMO seed can be used, and there's a process for making sure it's documented, such as checking with 3 entities to try to get it, and then getting signed forms from each of those entities that you attempted,
Okay.
and then the non-GMO seed could be signed off on,
Yep.
although that's discouraged because usually you can find organic seed if you look hard enough.
Absolutely. So then what happens when you find a violation or a non-compliance issue? What do people have to do to make that right? What do you have to do on your end?
In the simplest type of non-compliance, you would make note of it on the exit form that you do at the end of the audit, and then the farmer and myself would both sign the end of that exit form, and we would acknowledge that I had written that down, so we were both on the same page, and then I would turn, that would just be among my paperwork. It's interesting though, because the most common non-compliance is poor organization in their record keeping. So if a farmer doesn't have their inputs readily available, the seed tags that they planted, then that's a non-compliance which might be considered a simple non-compliance if they have other proof that these were the organic seeds they planted. But it's also possible that there is a more serious non-compliance where they are withholding information, and that might cause the certifier to maybe raise red flags. And so when I would turn in those more serious kinds of issues, the certifier would need to get a hold of that producer and follow up. My job as the inspector, it's important to say, is to be the eyes and ears. So when I was on the farm, I would collect that information and put together my report, and then I would turn it into my certifier. It was not my job to form judgment. It was simply to collect the information I could and to put it in my report I turned into the certifying body.
So then our last question for you today, Levi, what kind of challenges did you face either when becoming an inspector or being an inspector, if there were any?
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges is when you get on a farm that has a lot of complexity to it. A vegetable farm, for example, might have 50 different things that they're growing, and each of those things has, of course, their organic seed tags that are documented, but then a different vegetable might have different fertilizers or natural insecticides that are used. And so that's a challenge. But the other thing is that there is a book called OMRI, and so that book has a list of all the allowed substances that could be used as organic insecticides or herbicides, and that is a great resource, but it's also a list of many things. And so I was intimidated when I became an inspector by such a strong list. And not to mention that if a certain non-compliance is to be named, then there's a code for that non-compliance that if you're a very, very experienced inspector, you're going to write that that number for the code, and I could give some examples, but you write that number on that exit form next to the non-compliance. Well, I didn't ever have all those things memorized, and nor does an inspector need to have all that memorized. The resources are that you can go back to your IOIA manual, and it shows them, but also the certifying agency you work for is able to answer those questions to help you finish your final report that would include the identification of those non-compliances. So I've gone on a little bit, but those things I bring up because they were challenging, but yet I had a supportive community in my certifier to help me through those things, so it was fine.
Moving on to looking at your career in a perspective, what were the benefits that you derived from being an organic inspector?
It's a real privilege to go to a farm. Farmers can sometimes be private people that don't just want anybody out on the farm asking a bunch of questions, but the nature of an inspector is that you're there to collect information about the farm. And so having to navigate that in a sensitive way that shows respect to the people whose place you're on. Sometimes they'll invite you into the home and their kids are running around and you're there asking them questions about their farm. So it can be a delicate situation where you just want to be respectful. And so I enjoyed the opportunity to be with a farmer in that way. Other benefits were that the certifying agency that I worked for, there was really a close relationship with them. So I would call the main office and ask questions to the administrator there or my overseeing supervisor, who in my first year came to a couple of my visits and observed me and gave me feedback, and all that was just an opportunity to really grow.